The sun dipped low over the ridge, casting a soft amber hue across the quiet streets of Wilford, a speck of a town nestled in the valleys of Tennessee. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and somewhere a screen door creaked open, then shut. On the front porch of a weathered blue house sat a man with tired eyes and calloused hands, staring out at the world like it had kept moving while he stood still. His name was Earl Jennings, and today, like most days, he sipped sweet tea from a mason jar and listened to the world breathe. At 60 years old, Earl looked every bit of his age, maybe more. Deep lines etched into his face told stories he couldn't write down. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Not yet. Most folks in Wilford knew Earl as the quiet man who fixed tractors, the one who never said much but always showed up when someone needed help. He'd served in Vietnam, lost a brother in the war, and later lost his wife, Lillian, to cancer. Life had taught Earl to endure, not to dream. But what no one knew, not even his grown daughter, Marlene, was that Earl had carried a secret for 6 long decades. He never learned to read. And in the stillness of that porch, with a heart full of regret and a life half-lived, something stirred in Earl. A whisper, maybe. A promise. The beginning of something he never imagined he could do. He would learn. And he would write the story he'd kept locked inside him for far too long. Earl kept the secret buried like a war wound. Not a soul knew, not his daughter, not the preacher, not even the mailman he nodded to every Thursday. He'd gotten good at hiding it. Memorizing signs by shape and color. Faking his way through forms with a shaky X and a practiced grin. "Just forgot my glasses," he'd say. No one asked questions. Folks respected silence in Wilford. He hadn't planned on it being this way. Back in the early 60s, school was a place Earl went to for the free lunch and to stay warm in winter. His father, a rough, whiskey-soured man, saw reading as a waste of daylight. "You want to eat, boy? You work," he used to bark, shoving young Earl out the door before sunrise. By 14, Earl was out of school and under the hood of a Ford pickup, learning gears and grease instead of nouns and verbs. Then the draft came. Then Vietnam. Then life. And somewhere along the way, dreams died quiet deaths in back alleys of time. But now, alone in his house with peeling paint and too many empty chairs, Earl found himself sorting through a box of old things in the attic. Dusty photo albums. Letters he couldn't read. And a half-torn notebook with his wife Lillian's handwriting on the front. "For Earl, when you're ready." His hands trembled as he turned the first page. The letters danced like ghosts, familiar but foreign. He didn't know what it said. But he knew, clear as the sky above Wilford. It was time to try. The next morning, Earl rose before the sun. He sat at the kitchen table, the worn notebook in front of him like a locked treasure chest. He ran his fingers over the faded paper. Lillian had written that note nearly 20 years ago, before the cancer thinned her hair and quieted her laugh. He remembered her reading aloud sometimes, poems, little things she'd clipped from newspapers. She used to say, "Words are how we leave breadcrumbs in the dark, Earl. So folks can find us when we're gone." He nodded back then, pretending to understand. But now he ached for every breadcrumb he'd missed. He didn't have much to go on. No computer. No smartphone. Just an old rotary phone on the wall, and a yellowed phone book with names of people mostly gone or forgotten. He flipped through it slowly, searching. Finally, he stopped at a name, Mrs. Dorothy Elkins. She'd been a schoolteacher for nearly 40 years. Earl remembered her teaching 3rd grade when Marlene was little. She was tough, kind, and not the sort to laugh at a man's failings. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone, hands sweating. It rang 3 times. "Hello?" came a voice, warm and southern as sweet cornbread. "Mrs. Elkins," Earl said slowly, the words thick in his throat. "It's Earl Jennings. I need help. Reading help. I'm ready to learn." There was a pause. Then a quiet, steady reply. "Well, Earl, it's never too late to start. Let's begin." And just like that, at 60 years old, Earl took the first real step of his life. Mrs. Elkins lived just a few blocks over in a white cottage with rose bushes that spilled over the fence like gossip in a small town. She was 78, still sharp as a tack, and carried herself like a woman who'd wrangled generations of third-graders without ever losing her grace. Or her patience. When Earl arrived, she greeted him on the porch with a warm smile and a plate of lemon bars. "Learning goes better with sugar," she said, handing him one. Inside, the living room looked like time had stopped around 1987, doilies on every surface, family portraits in wooden frames, and a ticking grandfather clock that measured every second like it mattered. Earl sat on the edge of her floral couch, nervous like a boy on his first day of school. Mrs. Elkins handed him a children's book. Big letters. Simple sentences. A little boy and his dog on the cover. "Don't feel foolish," she said gently. "We all start somewhere. You didn't forget how to read, Earl. You were never given the chance to begin." His throat tightened. They started with the alphabet. Just the sounds. "A," she said. "Apple. B, ball." He repeated after her, slow and uncertain, like trying to find balance on a bicycle without wheels. But Mrs. Elkins didn't rush him. Every mistake was met with kindness. Every small victory was celebrated with a smile or a pat on the hand. When the hour ended, Earl stood to leave, tired but lighter somehow. "You're doing something brave, Earl," she said as he reached the door. "And brave men change the world in quiet ways." He nodded. For the first time in years, he felt like a door had opened. The lessons continued every Tuesday and Friday afternoon. Earl would show up with a notebook tucked under his arm and that old nervousness sitting in his chest. But little by little, the letters started making sense. D turned into dog, C into cat. Words began to settle in his mind like pebbles forming a path. But learning didn't come easy. Some days the letters blurred together. Some days he felt like a fool, especially when the words refused to stick, no matter how hard he tried. Once he slammed the book shut and said, "Maybe I'm just too old for this." Mrs. Elkins looked him square in the eye. "Earl Jennings, I've taught 6-year-olds who gave up faster than you. You've carried a war, a marriage, a family. Don't you dare tell me you can't carry this." That night, Earl sat alone in his recliner with the TV off. The house creaked with age, and a photo of Lillian on the mantel seemed to watch him quietly, her smile frozen in time. "I'm trying, Lil," he whispered. "I know I should have done this sooner. But I'm trying now." And for a brief moment, it felt like she was still with him. In the silence. In the words he was finally learning to unlock. That same week, he wrote his first sentence. It took him 20 minutes and a dozen erased attempts, but when he was done, he held it up like a child showing off a crayon drawing. "My name is Earl. I want to tell you a story." And somewhere deep in his chest, a door creaked open a little wider. Marlene hadn't seen her father in months, not since she moved to Atlanta for her nursing job. She loved Earl, but the distance between them was filled with unspoken things, regrets, pride, and years of silence about the one thing she never understood: why Dad never learned to read. When Marlene stopped by the Blue House that Saturday afternoon, Earl was outside, tinkering with an old lawnmower. He wiped his hands on a rag and smiled, but inside he felt the weight of years pulling at his chest. "Hey, Dad," she said, hesitant. "Hey, Marlene," Earl replied, his voice rough but warm. She glanced at the notebook on the porch table. "Is that?" "Yeah. I'm learning." Marlene's brow furrowed. "Why now?" He looked away, the sunlight catching the edges of his weathered face. "Because I'm tired of living half a life. I want to read your letters. I want to understand your kids' stories. I want to tell mine." Marlene shook her head, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "It's been a long time, Dad. What if it's too late?" Earl met her eyes. "It's never too late. You just have to start." For the first time, Marlene saw the man behind the silence, the man fighting to change, to heal old wounds. She sat down beside him, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "We'll do this together," she promised, and in that small moment, two worlds began to mend. With Marlene's quiet support, Earl's lessons gained new meaning. She'd bring him simple books to practice reading aloud during their visits, and sometimes they'd sit on the porch, Earl stumbling over words while Marlene laughed softly, encouraging him. One afternoon, while flipping through a worn photo album Marlene had brought, Earl stopped at a faded picture of him and Lillian, young and radiant in front of the church where they married. "Do you remember this day?" Marlene asked. Earl smiled, a tear threatening to spill. "Like it was yesterday. You know, Lil always carried a book in her purse. She loved to read stories about faraway places." Marlene nodded. "I wish I'd asked her to teach me more." Earl closed his eyes and took a deep breath. She wanted to. She tried. But she didn't know how to help me either. For the first time, Earl opened up about the struggles he'd buried. The shame of feeling left behind, the years of pretending he understood more than he did. "I wanted to be the man who could give you everything," he said softly. "But I felt broken." Marlene reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're not broken, Dad. You're brave." That day, Earl wrote a note in the margins of the photo album. To never stop trying. It was small, but it felt like a promise to himself, and to the family he was slowly reconnecting with. Wilford's community center was buzzing one chilly Saturday afternoon. Veterans from the nearby base had gathered for a reunion, old friends swapping stories, sharing laughs, and sometimes tears. Earl usually stayed on the sidelines, nursing a coffee and watching faces he'd known since the 70s. But this time, something was different. When Mrs. Elkins offered to accompany him, Earl felt a flicker of courage. At the center, he spotted old friends. Joe, a burly man with a booming laugh, and Frank, whose eyes held the sadness of too many battles. "Earl Jennings," Joe called out, clapping him on the shoulder. "Looking good, man. How've you been?" "Getting by," Earl replied, his voice steady but humble. Joe raised an eyebrow, then glanced at the notebook Earl carried. "What's that?" Earl swallowed hard. "I'm learning to read." A beat of silence. Then Frank smiled warmly. "That takes guts, Earl. Proud of you." The group gathered around, listening as Earl shared a little of his story, the secret he'd kept for years, the lessons with Mrs. Elkins, the hope of writing his own book. It wasn't easy. Some veterans nodded quietly, others looked surprised. But there was no judgment, only respect. And in that circle of worn faces and battle scars, Earl found a new kind of brotherhood. One that reminded him that it's never too late to heal, to grow, or to tell your story. Back at home, Earl sat at his creaky kitchen table, the evening shadows stretching long across the floor. The notebook lay open in front of him, but this time, it wasn't Mrs. Elkins' simple exercises. It was his own words, halting, uneven, but unmistakably his. He wrote about the day he left school, the hard eyes of his father, the boy he was before the war took him. He wrote about Lillian's laughter, the quiet mornings with Marlene, the ache of loneliness that settled deep in his bones after she passed. Each sentence was a battle, each word a victory. Sometimes he'd read aloud to himself, his voice rough but determined. "I was a man who didn't know letters, but I always knew stories." He thought of the people who might never believe a man like him could change. Who might say, "Too old, too late." But Earl wasn't listening anymore. He was writing not just for himself, but for every lost soul who needed a second chance. In those quiet nights, the man who couldn't read became the man who would write. And the first chapter was just the beginning. One rainy afternoon, as Earl was carefully practicing his reading, the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping his hands on his pants, he opened the door to find a young woman standing there with a camera slung over her shoulder and a friendly smile. "Mr. Jennings?" she asked. "I'm Sarah Miller, from the local newspaper. I heard about your story, how you're learning to read at 60, and I wanted to see if you'd be willing to talk." Earl blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the whole town to know his secret. But something inside nudged him forward. "Well, I reckon it's time folks hear it," he said, stepping aside. Sarah spent the afternoon recording Earl's story, the struggles, the victories, the reasons behind his decision to finally learn. She listened with genuine respect, laughing at his jokes and wiping a tear when he spoke of Lillian. By the time she left, Earl felt lighter, like a weight had lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't just a man struggling with letters anymore. He was a beacon for second chances, for hope. Little did Earl know, this visit would change everything. A few days later, Earl sat at the kitchen table, the local newspaper spread out in front of him. The headline read, "Wilford veteran learns to read at 60, writes his own story." His photo was there too, grinning, with his notebook clutched tight. He read the article slowly, each word sinking deep. The story painted a picture of a man who refused to be defined by his past mistakes. A man brave enough to change his life, no matter the odds. Phone calls started coming in. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate him. Even folks he barely knew sent letters of encouragement. Earl was overwhelmed but grateful. Marlene called that evening. "Dad, I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're inspiring more people than you know." Earl smiled, feeling the warmth of connection spread through the cold spaces that had once held loneliness. It was more than just a story in the paper. It was a reminder that no matter your age or history, the chance to rewrite your life is always there, waiting for you to pick up the pen. One evening, as autumn leaves rustled outside, Earl found himself staring at a letter he'd received from an old war buddy, Jim. They hadn't spoken since Vietnam, not really. The letter was simple, just a few lines, but it stirred something deep inside him. Jim wrote about the battles they'd fought, the friends they'd lost, and the heavy silence that followed. He confessed his own struggles with guilt and how, after all these years, he wished they could talk, really talk, about everything. Earl's heart tightened. He realized he'd carry not just the shame of illiteracy, but the weight of unspoken memories and broken friendships. With trembling hands, Earl picked up the phone and dialed Jim's number. "Jim?" "It's Earl," he said quietly. There was a long pause. "Earl." Jim's voice came back, rough but glad. "It's been a long time. I think it's time we talked," Earl replied. For the first time in decades, two old soldiers began to heal the wounds that had never truly closed. The phone call with Jim opened a floodgate of emotions Earl hadn't expected. Over the next few weeks, they talked every night, sometimes about the war, sometimes about their families, sometimes just about the quiet ache of growing older. "Remember that night in '68? Jim asked one evening, voice heavy. "When we thought we'd never make it out of the jungle?" Earl chuckled softly. "Yeah. You kept telling me to stay low. I thought you were just being bossy." Jim laughed. "Bossy? I was trying to keep us alive." Their laughter was raw, but it carried a weight of relief. Years of silence, regret, and pain slowly began to dissolve. Earl even read aloud parts of his new book to Jim, stumbling over words but pushing through. Sharing stories he never told anyone else. Jim listened, encouraged him, and reminded Earl that healing was a journey, not a destination. And with each conversation, Earl felt lighter. The past was still there, but it wasn't a chain anymore. It was a bridge. Word about Earl's journey spread beyond the veteran circle. Wilford, a town where everybody knew everybody's history, warts and all, began to rally around him. At the local diner, the waitress slipped an extra slice of pie onto his plate. "Keep going, Earl. You're doing good." The hardware store owner, a gruff man named Bill, stopped by with a stack of old newspapers. "Might help with reading practice," he grinned. Even the church held a small gathering in Earl's honor, where the pastor spoke about courage and redemption. But the biggest surprise came when the town library invited Earl to give a talk. At first, he was terrified, standing before a crowd of familiar faces, many younger than his own daughter. With shaking hands, Earl stepped up to the podium. He told them about his fears, his struggles, and the simple truth that it was never too late to change. The room was silent. Then applause, soft at first, then growing louder. Earl realized then that his story wasn't just his own anymore. It belonged to every single person who'd ever felt stuck or lost. And for the first time, Wilfred felt like home in a whole new way. With renewed purpose, Earl threw himself into writing. Every evening, after a day spent working or learning, he'd sit at his desk with a pencil and the notebook, scribbling sentences, crossing out words, and trying again. The book was messy, full of crossed-out lines and smudged ink, but it was his. A tapestry of memories, lessons, and hard-earned wisdom. One night, Marlene sat beside him, reading over his shoulder. "Dad, this is amazing," she said, eyes shining. "You're telling stories no one else can." Earl smiled, humbled. "I never thought I'd be a writer." "Hell, I never even thought I'd read a book." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "You're proof it's never too late." Slowly but surely, the pages filled up. Earl wrote about his childhood in Wilfred, the war, Lillian, and the long silence that followed. He wrote about learning to read and how it changed everything, how it gave him a second chance to live, to connect, to be heard. His dream was no longer just to finish the book, but to share it with the world. Even as Earl's manuscript grew, so did the doubts. Some nights he'd stare at the pages, thinking, "Who am I to write a book?" The voice of his old self, the boy too ashamed to read, whispered cruel things. What if no one cares? He'd wonder. What if I'm just a fool? But then he'd remember Lillian's words, the kindness in Mrs. Elkin's eyes, and the pride in Marlene's voice. He wasn't writing just for himself anymore. One particularly cold evening, after a tough lesson with Mrs. Elkins, Earl sank into his chair and sighed. "You can't give up now," he muttered. "This is your story. Your truth." He picked up his pencil, wiped away a tear, and wrote, "Every chapter is a chance to start again." That line became his mantra, a beacon to guide him through the nights of doubt and the slow, stubborn work of turning life's mess into meaning. And step by step, Earl moved forward, one word at a time. Months passed, and Earl's manuscript grew thicker, filled with stories, memories, and lessons from a lifetime lived mostly in silence. One day, Marlene surprised him with a phone call. "Dad, I found a publisher interested in your book," she said, barely containing her excitement. "They want to help you get it out there." Earl was stunned. "Me? A published author? I'm just a man who learned to read." Marlene laughed. "That's exactly why people want to hear your story. It's real, raw, and powerful." With trembling hands, Earl sent the manuscript. The wait was nerve-wracking, but when the acceptance letter came, he felt a surge of pride unlike anything before. The small town of Wilfred buzzed with the news. Earl Jennings, once illiterate, was about to become an author. It wasn't just a book. It was a testament to courage, second chances, and the power of never giving up. The day of the book launch arrived like a gentle storm in Wilfred's little library. The room was packed, neighbors, friends, veterans, even some folks from the local newspaper who had covered Earl's story from the beginning. Earl stood at the podium, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. His hands trembled as he held the first printed copy of Finding My Voice, a title that felt like a lifetime in the making. He cleared his throat and began reading an excerpt, voice cracking but growing stronger with every word. The audience sat spellbound, some wiping tears, others nodding in silent recognition. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Marlene hugged him tightly. "You did it, Dad." Earl smiled, eyes shining. "We did it." That night, as the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, Earl felt a peace he hadn't known since Lillian passed, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of finally coming home. Months after the launch, Earl's story began to ripple beyond Wilfred. Letters poured in from readers across the country, older adults inspired to learn, families moved to reconnect, veterans finding courage to share their own battles. Earl kept every letter in a wooden box on his desk, reading them when the loneliness crept back or when doubt whispered. One afternoon, Marlene brought her 2 kids to visit. As Earl read aloud to them from his book, the children listened wide-eyed, hanging on every word. "Grandpa, will you write more stories?" his grandson asked. Earl smiled, heart full. "There's always more to say, kiddo." And I'm just getting started. He looked out the window at the small town that shaped him, the same streets he'd wandered as a boy, the same faces he'd known all his life. His story wasn't just about learning to read. It was about connection, courage, and the power of second chances. And that legacy would live on, long after the final page was turned. Years later, Earl sat on his porch, a worn copy of Finding My Voice resting on his lap. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over Wilford's familiar streets. He smiled quietly, feeling the weight of a life fully lived. Marlene joined him, handing him a cup of tea. You ever think about where you'd be if you hadn't started learning? Earl chuckled softly. I'd probably still be lost in silence. But now, I've found more than words, I've found myself. She nodded, tears glistening. You gave us all a second chance. Earl looked up at the sky, the first stars twinkling. You know, Lil always said stories have power. I never believed her until now. Marlene smiled. You're living proof. And as the evening breeze whispered through the trees, Earl understood at last. It wasn't just about learning to read or writing a book. It was about healing the past, embracing the present, and lighting a path for those who come after. The man who once felt invisible had become a voice that would never be forgotten. And that, he thought, was the greatest story of all.